let's just stick on the subject that well, a couple of you mentioned. You talked about their allowable solutions. This piece of jargon, which is obviously incredibly important. And as I understand, we are going to get more guidance soon as to what needs to be in that guidance. What do you need to hear that clarifies it and that makes sense?
I mean, from a developer perspective, it needs to be flexible, because the industry ranges from the very larger house builders, the volume house builders doing several thousand homes a year, where we have sustainability teams and a lot of technical teams. But over 50% of housing is produced by smaller home builders, just 3 or 4 homes at a time. So whatever is set needs to be flexible enough to cope with a broad range of
So give us an example then of what we're talking about.
Well, an allowable solution, a small house builder might decide that it's not cost effective to produce that 30% of allowable solutions on site because of the cost prohibitiveness of it. And there may be a cost per tonne to buy that off, and some sort of tariff that goes in with that home, and they'll believe that that's the right solution for that home. That's the only way they can deliver a zero carbon home. For a large house builder like us, where we're looking at a several thousand home development, we can look at having a CHP plant on site, or link something with waste management, and actually get a benefit not just for the new homes, but the existing housing stock that we're working nearby to. So it needs to be flexible to cope with small and large.
John?
I think from our point of view, the issue would be to try to keep something local, so that the community within which the house building was taking place was the beneficiary of the solution.
Why is that important to you?
Well, I think as we move forward, regardless of what happens at the end of the next election, finance is going to be tight. Mortgages still aren't freely available yet, and people haven't got deposits for them in any event. Public expenditure is likely to be tight. If it's a Conservative government, they're talking very much about keeping it local, giving power and authority back to local councils to deliver. I think they might get the authority, but if the cupboard's bare, the authority it's a little bit neutral, because there's not a lot you can do with it if you haven't got the resources. So I think trying to generate from within your own and keeping something local. So if, for example, Crest Nicholson were working in our area, and there was the opportunity for some form of tariff to come over, and we applied that to, say, a retrofit campaign for our existing stock, I think that's the closest I can see to having your cake and eating it.
Yeah. Neil, do you want to answer the question that you posed?
Yeah, I think the one thing, picking up on Stephen John's points, I think the one thing that we need from allowable solutions, I think there's a consensus out there, is what Steve mentioned, which is some form of fund-based mechanisms. I think when allowable solutions were first given as a proposal, when you can't mitigate carbon emissions on site through renewable energy and energy efficiency, you need somewhere to go. And the proposals that came out in December 2008 from the central government proposed 7 measures, if you like, and one was to do more on site, which I think that perhaps the largest house builders in consortia can do that. But for the long tail of smaller house builders, there needs to be an easier mechanism. And time's moving on. I think that now we really need some form of fund-based mechanism, so that essentially the smaller builders particularly, and also on difficult sites, sometimes it comes down not to who the builder is, but what the site is. Particularly infill developments in cities and such like are quite difficult to achieve very high standards unless there's a local energy centre or whatever. So we need a fund-based range of mechanisms, and I pick up on the points about keeping it local, and I think maybe there's all sorts of layers of complexity, but I think it can be done, and I think that that's what people are calling for at the moment, is to find a way of putting money in a pot and see it spent on something worthwhile, maybe locally.
Why is there no premium yet in evidence for these homes? Is it at the level of psychology that the premium comes? Is it at the level of fact-based, my God, the bills are smaller? Where does the premium come from, if there has to be one?
Our experience has been we're into the code regime now, but prior to that we had eco good, eco very good, eco excellent. Part of it is the language we use. I think it's been mentioned earlier. Nobody really understands what tons of carbon reduction is, or CO2 reductions. The motor industry is actually quite clever, and whilst the previous speakers here were talking about lower road taxes. Actually, what drives people to buy a car is normally miles per gallon that you can get. 50, 60 miles per gallon is cheaper as
So it's something you see every week.
Absolutely, you see it as you fill your tank up. Now, in new homes, we haven't yet embraced, it's almost been driven so quickly that our marketing thoughts haven't, I mean, house builders are very good at marketing a product, but generally people buy a house for location, proximity to shops, schools, that's their priority. It's not the energy efficiency of it, it's how it appears and where it is. They're the two key drivers. So it's almost as though the energy efficiency is a nice to have, but it's not the main driver. That's why the second-hand stock have got such a huge challenge facing them for 2050, because the bulk of the existing housing stock, people just do not want to engage in the big agenda. The low-lying fruits of insulation are fine, but you go to Mr. Homeowner and say, we're going to render the outside of your house with insulation and make it look as though it's grey with an external, it's just not going to happen. Now, on new homes, we haven't got that problem. So, first of all, we haven't been good at saying, because we've been frightened and scared to, how much cheaper it is to run your home. We haven't got, whilst there's lots of facts out, we haven't really collected enough data. So one of the things we're doing is we get feedback from our customers, and as we've been producing eco-excellent homes or code homes, we're actually saying, how much does it cost you to run your home with a normal family? And it was great. I was on a site of ours in Street in Somerset, and a young mother came running out and was so proud that the running cost of a home was just £2 per week. And she thought that was absolutely, it's the first time anybody has ever made that comment. So it's not top of the agenda, and house builders, we haven't been good at marketing energy efficiency. So I think we need to change the language used. CO2 is a turn-off. It needs to be, I think, linked to running costs and something that's very tangible in somebody's in pocket. But coupled with that, mortgage providers do not differentiate between a high efficiency home and a second-hand stock. A valuer will not take that into account at all, and we need to look at valuation, and if you're going to look at mortgages, then mortgages are about disposable income, really. How much can you afford to spend on your home? And if running costs are much lower, you've got more to spend on buying the product. And we need to be thinking about those equations as well as the language we use.
If I could come back on that, about a year ago we launched what we think is the country's largest retrofit campaign, and we got a grant through the then Housing Corporation to do that. So obviously what I'm about to say is based on existing stock rather than new stock, but it's about the psychology of how people feel about that. Also about the practical difficulties of finding properties that you can actually go and retrofit. So we talk grandly about how many properties we need, 22 million, how much they'll be per unit, etc. We surveyed over 1,500 properties before we found 139 where we could carry out some quite basic retrofit works. So a combination of double glazing, more efficient boilers, insulation, solar panels, etc. And as part of the grant that we got, we've got to disseminate the information, and we've just started doing that now. And I mean, copies of this are available, but nevertheless, we go and ask the customers what they feel about the energy works that have been undertaken in their properties. And this one, it's just come off the press. But it says, for example, just a couple of examples. We asked our customers how they felt about environmental issues, cost of water, gas, electricity, and what they did about it. The majority said that they were concerned about it, but a bigger concern to them, and it's your point, was about how much it was costing them per week. Now, as they're part of this pilot, 89% of the 139 say they now make efforts to minimise their energy use at home. 66% always try to minimise their water use, 91% are now recycling, and so it goes on. But interestingly, we're measuring now that for those quite basic additions to the home on the retrofit, they've resulted in between 32 and 42% reduction in carbon emissions, exceeding the target, the interim target of 34% that the government has. And the savings per annum per household are estimated at the moment to be about £200. So that's really feeding into people's lifestyle. And one of the PAYS initiatives, the Pay As You Save scheme, where we're going into void properties now and carrying out the same work, we're now adding that onto the weekly rent. So you could rent the property from us for, say, £70 a week. We'll do the same type of retrofit work and charge. You'd save, we estimate, about £5 to £6 a week, and we'll charge you about £4 a week to do that. So we let our first property about a fortnight ago on this basis, and our housing manager was just telling me on the train on the way down that a lady who lived next door came into the area office on Friday and said, could I have all that work done to my house, and I'll pay it weekly as well. So the psychology of changing lifestyles, which we all need to do in our own homes, I suggest, as well as building new and as well as the existing stock, is a massive issue for the nation. But it suggests if we bite it off in small chunks, then there's a strong chance we'll get there.
Let me throw it in. Gentleman here at the front, and then anyone else who's got anything to say.
Hello, Nigel Banks from Ecom. I'm working on about 100 Code 6 schemes which are on site and will be on site this year. And one of the things for me is that allowable solutions on zero carbon is all about being zero carbon in theory according to a SAP calculator. And for me, one area where allowable solutions could be used is around behavioural change, as we're talking about, and using that money, which could be £5,000 or £6,000 a house, to incentivise people to achieve zero carbon reality. So if their house achieves zero carbon every year that they're using their house, they get that £5,000 or £6,000 back themselves through the energy saving they make in their house themselves. Is that a possible allowable solution?
I think it's a very good idea. I mean, from my perspective, I think the allowable solutions package needs more work. I think there are probably more opportunities to be identified, and I think there's more testing that needs to be done in terms of the benefits that they give consumers. So, I mean, I think it's a good idea. I mean, a piece of work has been done to look at what happens when you incentivise sort of behavioural change, or what happens when you fit devices that contribute to behavioural change, and it has been seen that over time, kind of the impact of those does drop. So, coming back and monitoring the impact of those, I think would be a benefit, certainly.
Anyone else with a point to make? Yes, the person right at the back there with his hand up. Microphone's coming across the front. Hold on just a second, I'll get to you.
Jules Swanson, McDonald Fulcrum. So, the need for joined-up approach was mentioned earlier, and it was also mentioned this morning at the launch of the GBC's manifesto about government as a barrier with different departments and all the rest of it. And as we've been talking, you've mentioned non-domestic, the existing stock, and the importance of infrastructure. And I just thought, at the moment, the Code for Sustainable Homes, for example, is supposed to lead building regs, but it's being consulted after building regs. We're all talking about the minimum energy efficiency standard, the carbon compliance standard, and the allowable solutions are separate things. They cross ministers. And the non-domestic definition and the national policy statements on infrastructure were all done separately, different government departments, different timescales. So I just wondered to everybody really, in clarifying the zero carbon conundrum, like how can we join it up?
Start at the end.
Thanks. That's a really good question. I mean, on a lot of the work that we're doing on both new build and existing on retrofit, we're keeping our MPs in the loop locally, and they're keeping ministers in the loop, and then we end up getting letters back from. On one example, we had almost the same letter from 3 different departments in government. So, I mean, if you've worked in local government, that's been the eternal conundrum. How on earth do you try and get it tied in together? I haven't got the answer. I'd be very interested if any of my colleagues have.
Very, very honest and unpolitician-like answer. It's nice to hear. Yeah, so come down to this end. Yeah.
I think we've made massive progress in the last 6 months, and whilst I hate to say what a good job Neil has done, the hub has made a tremendous contribution, and the whole of this agenda was driven initially by, I'm just a mere house builder, but for me by academics, and suddenly we've started to begin to get joined up thinking. Now maybe it needs a refurb hub as well as a new build hub, but the bit that's lacking at the moment is I think local authorities have got a huge role to play in this whole agenda, because we ought to be thinking beyond just the house and going into streets and communities. So if we can start to encourage that public debate, not just with the political parties, but also with local authorities, to bring them into some of the good work that's already being carried out in the hubs, I think we'll make progress. What's lacking in the joined-up thinking is, the power companies. They've got a huge part to play, and they're thought of independently. New homes is an easy touch because you can regulate it, and there are no choices. So a few years ago, the regulation was zero carbon all on site. The industry thought 2016, that's a long way away, we'll think about that in a few years' time. Now, of course, we're now starting to see, because we've done a lot of work through the hub and other bodies, that there is an allowable solution part of that gives some flexibility to the industry. That's further progress. We now need to embrace that debate with the power companies and local authorities. What we don't want is micro-generation on every site and untried bits of kit that foul with the consumer. Housing has always been a safe approach. We've been doing it for hundreds of years. What we don't want is untried bits of kit. And to me, it is a joined-up thinking with the power companies in particular. We've got a huge role to play. We're not, if we're developing a site of 2,000 homes, my guys come to me and say, Steve, what we're going to have is a great big CHP plant. I've got no idea how that's going to work, the long-term management of it, the buy-in to our customers. That's where a power company needs to come in. But Neil, I'm sure, is doing a lot of good work and can probably...
Okay, well, let's turn to Neil in a minute. Yeah.
Okay, Jules' colleague, I couldn't agree with anything he says in there or what's implied by it. I mean, in terms of some of the work that we do, I mentioned the 2016 task force. That's attended by CLG and DEC ministers, and you'd imagine that probably would do it. And there are parts of this work that you can sort out between those two departments. But when you enter into things like allowable solutions, and there's an idea from the front down here, where do allowable solutions stop? You could have one for transport, for example, to contend with issues regarding transportation on isolated sites and such like. Then you are into cross-departmental work. You're probably into Treasury, most certainly, for allowable solutions. You're probably into biz in some way or another in terms of innovation. And I think that is a major challenge going forward, is it to nail this definition. We've got to get everybody across government working together. I think the task force, and picking up on Steve's point, maybe you do need a hub for refurb. One thing that we've shown actually is when you actually get ministers together from different departments, things can happen. Last meeting in January, we saw that in action. But sometimes there are that many ministries or departments involved. It's just beyond the scope of the people in the room.
Ed,
I have to say, I kind of echo the support that needs to go to the hub for trying to coordinate kind of regulation and regulatory devices, because it is a challenge, I think. If you've been involved in that process, it is a very complex issue. But for me, if there were a magic bullet, it would be to reorientate the discussion towards consumers. Move it away from technical issues about what are these allowable solutions, who's going to pay for them, what levels of fabric insulation do we want to achieve, toward what does the consumer want? Because I think, I sat in the discussion this morning about refurbishment. If you'd walked in today, had never heard of zero carbon, never heard of the hub, never heard of allowable solutions, I think you might walk out thinking, this is a bit scary, I'm going to stick with my kind of drafty Georgian property because I know where I'm coming with that, I've lived in it all my life. But actually we need to get people to understand that actually this is a benefit to them, and dissolve the complexity and just talk about simple homes that are well heated and are secure and are low risk.
Yeah. Let's come back in on that. I think the consumer research we've done really drives that home. Actually, people don't understand the zero carbon agenda. But when you ask them about it, they think it's technology-led, and that's because maybe people like me turn up and talk about PV, ground source heat pumps and air tighteners, and that's not what engages people. But in terms of also, it is all to do with value and benefits and getting those points over. In terms of labelling, which I think was picked up maybe by Stephen, for those of us in the industry to try to understand, the different measures, you've got SAP, you've got energy ratings, EPC ratings, eco-home ratings are still out there, code for sustainable homes, there's so many different measures which we use and we confuse ourselves. So what chance has a consumer got? So I think we've got to find a way of being consumer-led to understand what they want, as John was mentioning earlier on.